Hi, welcome back to another episode of Globalized Podcast. Today we have Mr. Christopher Corkery with us from Targus. Thank you for your time.
No problem. Happy to be here, guys.
Thank you.
So can you start off by explaining your role at Targus and kind of what you do in your company and like what your company does as a whole?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so my role, I'm the global head of supply chain and operations. So that means I manage everything from procurement and all of our factory relationships and all of our manufacturing globally to quality, making sure we're delivering good quality products, and then operations. So from logistics and supply chain to planning. So basically everything from the factories on back to your front door, I manage.
That's a lot on your plate.
A little bit, yeah.
So can you kind of take us through what your company does and like what they produce?
Sure. Targus is an Orange County company. It's been here for a while. I think we're 35, 37 years old now or something like that. And Targus is most famous for being one of the first companies, if not the first company, to make a computer carrying case. So you think of a backpack now, but we made the original ones back when computers were like big bricks and you had to roll them in big suitcases. We made the original ones back then for IBM and all these other Long Electronics and all these other companies that have now gone bankrupt. So I think we're known for being that black bag company, but actually our biggest business now is in technology products. So docking stations, I'm sitting here looking at 3 monitors at home. I'm not sure if you guys are, but docking stations and mice and keyboards and things like that, as well as still backpacks. So
Okay.
Cool.
you might know our brand from Best Buy or something like that, but in truth, most of our business is B2B. So we supply mostly to the business segment. That's why our brand is probably not as well known as the things that we actually do.
Oh, so
When was that? Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, when was that change kind of made where you started focusing on like technology, like more?
Well, I can't really say that because then the bad guys will get mad at me.
Oh.
I think we focus on both equally.
Okay.
You know, we have manufacturing now in 11, 12 countries, something like that.
Mhm.
Some of them for bags, some of them for more
Wow.
products. Our biggest products right now are docking stations. So I think we're probably the 4th largest in the world after the big OEMs, Dell, HP, and Lenovo. It's probably
wow.
Targus is probably the next.
So this manufacturing, where does like the most of your production happen?
Well, traditionally, most production give you a historical lesson in supply chain, right? So I'm a little bit older. I've been around for a few years. I actually lived in Asia for about 20 years.
Wow.
And so I've been doing manufacturing and supply chain for the last 25 years or so, most of it in Asia. There was a great time in history for supply chain people, and that was probably 15, 20 years ago. If you wanted to know your costs, you went to China and you found a factory, and it was very simple. And your skills, the skills that you needed were very simple. You just did your negotiations and you got a price. It was much lower than you got anywhere else in the world. The quality was decent. And then you just did the math for figuring out how much you had to order when. It was a really simple, lovely world. It's a lot more complicated than that now.
Yeah.
So
you can go. You can go. It's fine.
Sticking with this whole supply chain thing, recently in the past 2 years, there's been obviously a supply chain crisis with COVID, with shipping, tariffs, issues at ports, labor shortages, chips, and a whole bunch of like chain reactions.
Yeah.
Can you kind of take us through like which of those have affected your company and which have made your job harder?
All of the above, yeah. No. So maybe we take a step back and think about where the supply chain's crisis starts, right? And I think I take a little bit different viewpoint than some. And so I'm probably wrong, but at least this is my perspective. It starts in about 2018, 2019. You know, that's when the world, before that, everything was still in China. Maybe there was ancillary things in Taiwan or Thailand or what have you. There was still manufacturing in other countries, but China was still your main hub. And it was our main hub as well. And then the tariffs came from President Trump in 2018, 2019, right? Now imagine that was basically in broad, it was the 25% tariff on everything coming from China. So now think about that. Your prices didn't go up 25%. What that meant is every company in the world was scrambling. How can they get manufacturing outside China?
Right.
So at that point, 2018, 2019, I was there moving a lot of our business out of China to avoid the tariffs. Not European business necessarily, not the things we ship to Europe, but the things we ship to the US for sure. So we took on countries like Cambodia, Vietnam,
Right.
Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, and India. And so we did a lot of manufacturing in India as well. So if you look at that whole really easy world of supply chain where you went to China, you do already stretched. Now you took, the fact is the components still came from China, the materials still came from China. So now that meant instead of trying to forecast what you guys are going to buy 2 months from now, 3 months from now, I've got to forecast what you guys can buy 5 months from now, 4 months, and it makes it much harder.
Yeah.
So that's where I think a lot of the supply chain crisis started. The supply chain got, example, you guys might not think about, but even take a simple backpack. If I make a simple backpack now, my supply chain isn't just find a good factory and have another manufacturing site outside of China as well for the US. Maybe I even have to trifurcate it and have one in India as well. So oftentimes we're bringing in a product. Now I have 3 separate countries doing the same product with the same materials, all with different lead times, all with different, and just when we thought we had that under control, that's when COVID came. And COVID is one that really, and ultimately I think COVID is where most of this real challenging period started, right? And it starts with the basics, supply and demand, right? Supply and demand is real simple, right? The demand when COVID came just off the everyone was scared. So all the factories that had workers and all the factories that were producing for us basically were closed for a while because they had no demand. No one was buying anything. And a new mouse, all this stuff I had to buy. I have a new desk, a new rising standing desk that has computer chips in it, has a lifter and has all the power supplies and all that kind of thing. All of that doubled up what I was going to normally buy. So the demand was huge, right? So on the demand side, it was crazy. It changed, everything changed. What people were buying changed, and the amount people bought was so much more than ever before. School districts were having to buy new laptops and new for everyone. You had to buy new backpacks for or cases for your Chromebooks. Then on the supply side, the factory side, you had worker shortages. People couldn't get back to the factories from their homes because of COVID. People didn't go to work. They stayed at home for 6 months or a year. That means what we could actually produce went down significantly. But what the demand was much higher. So COVID was the first step in all of this, I think.
So with dealing with this, like what was like your guys' like main strategy in kind of like, or when you like diversified your production back in like 2018, 2019, did that help with this whole thing? Because you had like, if one place was kind of like low, you could like outsource from like another place more, or did that like make a difference at all?
Yeah, I think that's why I mentioned it. It actually didn't help. It hurt. And here's why it hurt, because the materials for a backpack still came from China. The semiconductors still come from China. So now instead of just having a very simple supply chain in China where all the components and materials and the metals and the semiconductors come from China, I actually had to get those semiconductors, move them out to a different country. And so it made it longer and more complex and more difficult. In the meantime, everyone started seeing the problems. And so we started putting in orders for even more. So consumers, businesses, companies started saying, well, let's double up our orders because we don't know what's going to happen. So we want to have inventory. So it meant demand kept spiking even beyond what the actual need was. Demand kept spiking. At the other hand, the production went down. So it was, and the other challenge that we have oftentimes is that production will be fine and it'll keep increasing and then it stops. There's a COVID outbreak in the factory. There's a COVID outbreak in the region. There's a COVID outbreak in the country or at the port. You know, we've had COVID outbreaks in LA Long Beach multiple times in the last 2 years. We've had them in Shenzhen and Shanghai. So it's made it much more difficult.
Do you think that the supply chain like issue is still at large like today? And if another like crisis were to occur, like maybe a few years down the line, kind of how it was back in 2018, like do you think you guys have kind of like taken necessary precautions to kind of like be safe and kind of be prepared if something like that were to like hit again?
Well, I think the word that everyone uses now is resiliency.
Uh-huh.
So before this, I think everyone talked about having a lean supply chain. How can we
Yeah.
save money? How can we not have any inventory? Just-in-time inventory is something that the auto manufacturers have perfected. And basically, the whole world has been working on just-in-time inventory, where we tried to have no inventory in the US. We tried to have it on boats, just cycling through, arriving just in time for us to ship
Right.
it out. And now what everyone is talking about is resiliency, supply chain resiliency, which means the ability to move things back and forth, the ability to survive these kind of crises. I would say the world as a whole is not ready for another crisis. Materials still come from China, components still come from China. I know you guys have read about the CHIPS Act from the US government to try and bring some manufacturing of semiconductors back to the US. It's going to take a lot of years before you can build up a supply chain that is not focused solely on cost.
Yeah.
So I think we've done what we can, but there's still a lot more work to do.
Yeah.
So as far as like, or like said, as far as being more prepared for next time, is there anything you can do like to like, because like I mean obviously like you can't like predict these events, but has there been like a industry shift towards focusing like less on China and maybe on other places for like the materials themselves, or is it still like largely like
No, I think
dependent on China?
there's a definite desire to do it, but it takes time, right?
Right.
It takes a lot of time to build up the infrastructure, the
Right.
roads, the ports, the railways. All those things will take years to build. To build up the semiconductor manufacturing is going to take years.
Right.
So it's really going to take some time before the world could look at a different kind of supply chain. That doesn't mean that everyone's only based on China, but it does mean that we're having to work a lot harder to try and survive. So materials, for example, in the past, maybe most procurement organizations or supply chain organizations didn't really get into the materials and components too far unless they're a big company and they had teams to do that. Now we just have to do it. There's nothing you can do. You have to go back and you have to try and find alternate sources. So when I'm building a backpack in India, for example, I have to locally source all the materials. And that wasn't something that we did in the past. In the past, you always bought the materials from China and then manufactured in India. Now you actually have to find the materials in India. There's absolutely a way to bring back manufacturing, but I do think it's going to take a lot of time and it's going to take a lot of investment. If you just take the CHIPS Act, for example, you guys read that, right?
Yeah.
Bringing back semiconductors to the US, and everyone raised flags and said this is a great thing.
Yeah.
And it's a good step forward. It's $52 billion, I think, over 5 years. But did you know that the largest semiconductor manufacturer, Taiwan Semiconductor, they themselves are investing $44 billion this year.
Wow.
So what they're investing in the US, I think they're talking about taking some money from that CHIPS Act and building a foundry in Arizona somewhere, I believe. And that's going to end up being 1% of their global supply. So
it's still,
is it going to help?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Is it a good step in the right direction? Absolutely.
Right.
But our labor costs are also very high, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys have also seen in Orange County that, it was probably $12 or $14 an hour to, go to a McDonald's or something. And now every time we drive through the drive-thru, $18 or $20 an hour.
Yeah.
Transfer that to manufacturing and you figure someone in Asia somewhere is making $4 or $5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's gonna come from industries that aren't labor intensive. So you can build a big chip manufacturing. You don't have to have a lot of people in there. A lot of it's automated.
AI.
You'll be able to do it. But things that are labor intensive are going to be really, really hard to move back.
So you'd say that like, in order to compete with China, we need to beat like their labor by like higher tech here. We can like get away from like the labor part of it to like AI and stuff. So like, do you think that like companies here should focus more on like developing tech and like fully automated plants, and then kind of like following like the whole like Tesla model where like it's all like like electronically based stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I think you can't rely on cheap labor. Cheap labor has always been the reason we moved around the world. You move to Korea and you move to Taiwan and then you move to China, and then now they're looking for other places in West Africa or India to get cheap labor. The one challenge I would have to what you're saying there, though, is why would you think that factories in Asia wouldn't be investing in the same technology?
Right. True. Yeah.
So they would be automating at the same pace. That's going to cause some real social problems if you don't have, if the workers don't have jobs anymore.
Yeah.
As they did here in the 1970s. But when I lived in China maybe 8 years ago, I helped work on building a smart factory for a white goods manufacturer. They're making one of the world's largest manufacturers of washing machines and things like that. And they were building a smart factory 10 years ago. And so this is fully automated IoT smart factories, and that was a long time ago. So, So we would have to still learn a lot from Japan, learn a lot from Korea, learn a lot from China, because the automation there is when I go back, they always called me old fashioned from America. Because we're still so far behind where they are in Asia or some parts of Korea or Japan or whatever.
So kind of shifting the focus of this, or on this podcast, we try to like focus more on how these global things affect OC and like our local like SoCal, like the whole like region. So obviously like we can't like keep up with like labor like as they can in like Asia, stuff like that. So where do you think OC fits into this whole like global scheme of stuff? Like what can companies focus more on in OC with this, like in like response to this whole like supply chain crisis and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think that there's certainly an impact on us as human beings in Orange County, right? Costs have gone up significantly over the last few years, right? Inflation is terrible, and inflation is not getting any better. When you're looking at companies are going to have to be a lot smarter and a lot leaner. They're going to have to be a lot more creative, a lot more inventive. Maybe it's a good piece of news. Orange County companies maybe aren't as large as some other areas like New York or something like that. Right? So the companies tend to be a little bit smaller and maybe a little bit more nimble and a little bit more flexible. Maybe they have a chance to really drive changes, drive automation, drive new methods of working.
Experiment.
Yeah, exactly. But truthfully, it's going to be it's a hard situation for everyone. It's not that China dominates the world from now and forever, but it's there and it's formidable and we've been there for 20 years. It's going to take time to change.
Shift. And then kind of shifting a bit more like out towards like LA and like the ports like along the coast.
Sure.
You like see any way that maybe there could be better like cooperation between like government, ports, and companies to where the whole process is like a bit more streamlined and there's less like kinks along the way? And it's like a broad question, but like, do you have any like thoughts about that, ideas?
Yeah. So everyone in Orange County, maybe at one point we were driving by Huntington Beach or something, we saw all those boats parked out there, right? There was like a big parking lot for a year, right? It effectively what it was is like one of those nature shows where you see a big boa constrictor and he eats a small little lamb or something, and there's a big round thing in the middle of his stomach. And you're trying to force that through the mouth and force that all the way back. That's sort of what it was like here in LA Long Beach, right? You were trying to force so many containers through that you just couldn't force anymore. And so, yes, the government stepped in and said they want to work things, they want to expand the hours, but there are other things involved. For example, there's a huge shortage of truckers in the U.S. You can bring the boat in, you can park it, and instead of it taking 1 day or 2 days or 3 days to unload, maybe it takes 5 days because you don't have the trucks there, you don't have the crane operators there. So actually, you're really going to have to start at the very basics and make sure that truckers make a good living, make sure that they want to work as a trucker, make sure that the rail lines are built up and modernized, make sure that there are enough crane operators there, build out the infrastructure. Truthfully, it's a long-term process. It's not something that's really short-term fix. I do think that there's a way for the government to help, but it's not as easy as it looks because there are these human parts of it, like the number of truckers who are willing to go to the port.
Is there a way you think to like expand like this, like for example, like LA Long Beach like take up like most of like shipping in like SoCal, but if you think about like the stretch down like to to like San Diego, like the parts where like there's like not much going on.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a business here to like maybe it could be like a lucrative business to like starting ports or like finding a way to like kind of divide up the shipping so where like if one port is down, you could get other like float like come in and
Yeah, I think there's probably both an opportunity for LA Long Beach to look at how they can make things more efficient and be able to push their throughput higher, but also for ports in San Francisco, ports in Seattle, Portland, Vancouver to perhaps expand a little bit as well, right? But that huge flood of, you're at the same time we're talking about manufacturing more in the U.S., so you need less things from Asia.
yeah.
So actually, the volume goes down.
Yeah.
And we did see a demand like we've never seen before, and may never see again. So I'm not sure anyone wants to come in and invest billions of dollars to make a new port, right?
Yeah. Move away. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's coming down right now. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But just out of interest, another really interesting part of this that we never think about is actually the containers. The container itself. That was actually one of the most difficult things over the last 2 years. How to get a container.
Oh, really?
It was you wouldn't think about that.
Yeah.
So a container comes from Asia on a boat. It gets off. It gets unloaded. But half the time they go on to trains and they go into St. Louis or Chicago. It takes them a couple of weeks to get back, which means that all this stuff is coming from Asia in containers, and you don't have the same amount of containers going back. You have less.
Yeah.
Right.
So what that meant is the shipping companies who own the containers, they just would stop at Hong Kong or Shanghai or Taiwan. They wouldn't go to places like Vietnam, Philippines, India, Cambodia, where we had just said our supply chain is expanded. So now you have to get things out of there. So you couldn't actually get a container out of there unless you paid incredible amounts of money. So the freight costs for me went up as much as 800%.
Wow.
Because you couldn't get a container.
Wow.
You wouldn't think about that box being that important. That box is the baseline of everything. So
yeah, it's crazy.
It is.
So one thing I'm curious about with like these outside factors where like you can't like control much, as like a company where it's like not like too big and focus in a place like OC where like prices are so high where like you can't like do something like yourself like individually like here. How do you guys like react to these kind of like supply chain issues? Like, is it kind of in a position where like is it like a tough spot, or like is there any like way you can like kind of like mitigate like the damage it has, or is it kind of just like a helpless situation?
Yeah. So it's funny. My boss often says we are the largest or the smallest global company in the world. and what that means is we actually have people in all these countries. I have a team sitting in Cambodia, teams in India, teams in China. So actually I have people on the ground, and that's one of the most important things you can do. What I've seen is that companies our size or smaller who didn't have really effective teams over in Asia, over at the start of manufacturing, right in the factories on a daily basis, they're really struggling right now because they didn't have the great relationship with the factories, and they weren't able to watch and make sure everything was going on, right? I think in my pre-COVID, I was probably in Asia once a month.
Oh, wow.
And I would fly there, right? After living there for 20 years, and I think that's really the critical thing. You have to have people on the ground. You have to have people there because if you try and phone it in, you're in real trouble. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of people have been struggling with that.
So it goes like down to like the basics of like just person to person interactions there.
Yeah.
Or being in the factory, because a factory will tell you yes, and they really mean maybe. Right? You need to be watching every day. You need to be looking at their components incoming. You need to be, and again, this is where the supply chain stretched into all these different countries. Your team is now stretched, and yet you have to double their workload because you have to ask them what came in today, which components came in today, which components are we still missing. And that's something that, if you don't have someone on the ground really pressing and
on top of it
every day, you're flying blind.
Yeah. So with expanding to like, or I guess with expanding to like different countries, how does like challenges arise where like if like one country's making like products better, like a higher quality, like how do you kind of like equalize the qualities of like these different places? Because like, I mean, like I'm sure like it must be like really different, like dealing with different countries.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of strategies for that. Obviously, you need to start with simpler products, higher volume, simpler products.
right?
One of the things that China gave us over the last 20 years is the ability to do very low minimum order quantities. You could get 1,000 pieces of something, and you could make it very efficiently. When you transfer that to other countries, it doesn't work. They want to have 10,000, 20,000 pieces because they have to set up their line. They have to set up their people. They have to teach their people how to make this. And then they increase their efficiency over the next week or 2 weeks or something like that. So you start with those things that are high volume, and you start with the things that are simple. And then you have to gradually put people in the factories, and you have to work on quality and what can you do from transferring in terms of quality improvement. But ultimately, where you end up is with a trifurcated or bifurcated supply chain, which hopefully everything is the same in every country, and you're able to flex back and forth, and you're able to continue to develop where you get materials or components from different locations, so that you're continually having multiple supply chains that you're running at the same time. So the complexity has grown significantly in the last 2 or 3 years, and I think it's something that most companies haven't yet realized. And I would say there's also a really big factor is the human element factor, which is the human element. People in procurement and operations, they have a certain skill set developed over the last 30 years. How to work in China, how to get the price down, how to order from here to there. Now you're talking about multiple countries. So mathematics has become very, very important. And it wasn't in the past, right? It was much simpler in the past. So now you're talking about how can you negotiate certain things? How can you manage the components at a central level and then split it off into multiple countries? That's a different skill set for most of the people. Different than what they've been doing for the last 20 years. So it's really causing a lot of challenges in terms of just human resources and in terms of getting young, smart people who really are willing to deal with very complex issues.
It's like kind of the job search like changing to like towards like higher educated, more like well-off people.
Data intense.
Okay.
I think, in my opinion, data is crucial, much more than it used to be. And I think that the more you drive that data, the more you're going to need educated people, the more you're going to get into supply chain, just because they have a passion for math, which is the opposite thing as what you would normally think, right?
So in every episode, we want to end off by talking about two things really. How you feel that like the government could make a difference here, and then how people in SoCal could make a difference. So obviously, like with Biden's like chip plan and plans like stop like outsourcing so much labor, they're good steps. But do you think there's like something else that like we could like communicate like towards our our representatives, and more like help you can get from like leadership where it would help solve like these issues where you're so dependent on foreign nations?
So again, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. It's just going to take time, and it's going to take investment, and it's going to take intelligence. So even the chip, if we go back to the CHIPS Act, it sounds good. We know that it's going to be dwarfed by the actual chip manufacturers, and it's not going to make that big of a difference short term. We also know, by the way, when you take that chip, now we're going to make chips in the US. That's good, but in order to test the chips, you're going to have to send them back to Taiwan. In order to assemble the chips into your new iPhone, that's going to come out of China, it's going to come out of Vietnam, it's going to come out of India. So you're still going to be taking the chip in the US and sending it back somewhere in Asia, because you have to have that whole supply chain built in the US. So that's going to be a long-term process. So, but there are a couple of things. One is, infrastructure is very important. Ports, roads, the boring stuff. You've probably seen many things in newspapers about how we have crumbling infrastructure. It's true. If you compare our roads and our railroads and it's amazing how behind the times we are, because we just haven't invested in them. And we really need to invest in infrastructure, because that's what allows companies to build on this national highway system. That's what allows them smooth transportation, efficient transportation, right? And that's going to be very, very important, is infrastructure investment. And education. Ultimately, I'm a believer that you're not going to be able to change this overnight. This 30 years in the making, for better or worse. We need to invest in the right kind of education, so that guys like you, when you're through college and you're into a job, you're doing something that I can't imagine. And
Yeah.
I think that's going to be really, really critical. Right.
So,
Mhm.
I mean, that kind of is like my next question. Do you think that's where OC fits into this big puzzle piece? Turning out more like educated, critical thinking, creative people to like help solve these crises, or is there any like, other fit that you see our community fitting into this global scheme?
Yeah, I think Orange County has fantastic education, obviously, right? From the grade school and high school level up through colleges, there's a real opportunity to develop something that could shape the future of the world, right? Even Irvine, UC Irvine, it's a good engineering school, right?
Right.
Mhm.
So, but you need to focus on things that matter. We focused on a lot of, the community colleges and what have you can feed into UC Irvine, and it's really going to take being very dynamic and being very cutting edge and being in front of the trends in terms of figuring out what skill sets we're going to need in order to really do well in the future.
Right.
Because the world
Yeah.
has changed so much. Right?
Yep.
And so I do think that with this great solid base of educated people, educated, young people who are going to be the future, I think that Orange County could really add a lot.
Mhm.
We're very fortunate here, right?
Yeah, we are.
We really are. Yeah. Mhm.
Right. And so we just need to make sure we take that not just in terms of passing good tests now or passing tests now, but really focus it on what are we going to need in the world in 10 years. And that's from environmental science to supply chain to wherever.
Yeah. So to kind of like take opportunity of like the benefits that we're given and like use that to do better and whatever way we can.
I think for one way or another in the last 2 years, the world has changed immeasurably.
Right. A lot.
And it won't go back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The old days of going to China, finding a factory, and it's over.
They're done. Yeah.
Mhm.
So now the world is more complex. Now we need to figure out what is going to be needed for 10 years. In 10 years, what do we need? Where do we need to be? And we need to point everyone in the same direction. That's really where you see the hope. If you're talking about the next year, it's scary.
Yeah.
That was a great way to put it. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
I learned
thank
a
you.
lot. Yeah, a lot of like pieces came together. So
Mhm.
thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
No, happy to do it. Appreciate the time, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.